as you probably could tell from the syllabus you received, it's really quite clear that this introductory session is going to be very heavy on the psychology part and on knowledge that might be a little, that might be stretching you. Some of it is common sense, but some of it, there are some quotes from research that's been done recently. And I'm very excited to do this. This topic has always been incredibly important to me because of my personal story and because of my ministry, and also because of the charism of the Oblates. The Oblates do ministry among the poor and the poorest of the poor. And we are aware that when we do ministry with the poorest of the poor, we will meet people that have been especially challenged in ways that might be even foreign to many of us. We all are challenged in different ways, but some of the people we serve are much more vulnerable than we are. In fact, it awakens vulnerability in ourselves. And so I have ministered, and I'm very thankful to the people in spiritual direction and in other capacities that have taught me about resilience, in just being a witness of them struggling with great stress, great adversity, or with moderate adversities. And witnessing this for me was a true experience of Jesus who died and was resurrected. Every single person was a place for me to notice. Every single order I preached and every person I listened to who struggled enabled me to come up with what I have to offer you for the next 5 weeks. I'm really excited to do this with you, and I hope you are as excited as I am. Please respect where you are in terms of the amount of energy you want to invest in this and in the amount of time you want to invest into the readings. I have been very generous, as I normally am. I can't help it. It's part of my personality. I've been very generous, and some articles are longer than others. When I will write a book on resilience, it'll be easier because then I'll be able to reference the book only. But this time, I really had to go and pick here, there, and everywhere. And I tried to respect very dutifully all the laws of copyright. So that's the reason why you have a lot of documents that you're going to be looking up online. Many of them, luckily, on trauma and on COVID and other issues have been unlocked because they have been available for people to consult during these very trying times. So we're going to begin right away with, I have a PowerPoint presentation that you will receive tomorrow, all of you. You don't need to take notes. You can if you want to, but every single note of my class for this evening is in a PowerPoint presentation. So you can relax, you don't need to rush, you don't have to write all of this. I'm gonna send everything to you tomorrow. I didn't want to send it in advance. I just wanted to keep the energy of anticipation flowing. Okay, let me share my screen. So here we are. Let me get, here we go. So this is a class called Resilience, Faith, and Discipleship. And the general plan for the 5 weeks you have received. So here it is. Today we're going to look at the challenge of transformation and what that means, especially psychologically and sociologically. Then next week, we'll look at resilience in community. Week 3, we'll look at resilience and spirituality. And we have a guest speaker that will speak to us on a very intriguing topic. And again, I leave the energy of anticipation to you, although it's in your syllabus. The 4th week, we'll have theology of resilience. I'm still waiting to hear for a confirmation from the guest speaker, but I'm almost sure he'll give me a go. And then last week, with the conclusion, will be practices for resilient discipleship. And it probably is redundant to say that we are called to do resilient discipleship because discipleship is resilient in its very nature. So today we're going to look at trauma and resilience, some of the definitions, the state of the research, the terminology, and I hope to illustrate this with a film. And then we'll finish with two shorter sections on resilience as spiritual process and resilience and faith, which is basically going to be an introduction for our next 4 classes. So what is trauma and what is PTSD? Many of you have heard about it, and unfortunately the term is overused. I've been traumatized by waiting in line at the HEB. Sorry, that's not trauma. So it's part of our regular speech patterns and psychology in general, but trauma as a term specifically has been used a lot and is used more and more. So these are kind of like operative definition of trauma and PTSD. PTSD refers to post-traumatic stress disorder. It's the official term that's recognized by the International Health Organization as well as the American Psychological Society. Trauma is an experience of people that have survived war, oppression, child abuse, marital violence, natural disaster, or disaster of human origin that is life-threatening. In the accidents that are life-threatening, overwhelming events that have in common a mental and a psychic response that's caused by a traumatic incident. So often when we speak of trauma, we speak of one event. But it could be that trauma is experienced over time. So it could be a series of events. For instance, children who are abused and who experience abandonment or neglect at a very moderate or severe rate over a longer period of time. You can be speaking here of what we call complex trauma, and we'll get to that. So what makes a trauma versus not a trauma? Let me give you an example. Let's say that you have had to go visit somebody in the hospital and or the hospice, and they've been sick and they have been struggling with cancer, and you know that they're going to be dying. The difference with a trauma would be that for the very same event, if the death is sudden, even if it was anticipated, for instance, some people have experienced siblings, parents, friends, co-workers who died suddenly, even if they were sick. And suddenly, because they didn't anticipate they would die so quickly, or specifically of COVID. And that way, you can say that it's possible that they've, as we call it, have experienced a post-traumatic experience of various degrees. Now, death and dying are part of life. What makes an experience traumatic is its suddenty, its nature in terms of how horrific it might be, the time that it has occurred, the amount of time that you were exposed to it, specifically whom. If you've experienced it in a family in very close proximity, chances are that the type of exposure was much more long during. And of course, the severity of the trauma will vary in terms of how people react, but also what kind of experience they're having. So there's 2 elements that are. The first initial impact, and I don't know about how you experience COVID, but the way many people have experienced COVID or other experiences is that it was a shock. It's not like last year we were told, get ready, a pandemic is coming. So chances are many of us have experienced shock, denial, and confusion because of the suddenty of the experience itself. And this applies across the board, not just to pandemics, but of course to any traumatic event or incident, including what we called traumatic bonds, difficult traumatic bonds amongst especially people who have experienced difficult time in their family of origin. We move on then to where did trauma originate? We first heard the word trauma in the study of traumatology. It came from American soldiers who had psychosomatic effects of the Vietnam War. So you might say that in terms of science, it's new. It's not in terms of human experience, it's not. As I will say next week, we know that there are excerpts and there are certain poems and realities, especially with Greeks and the Romans, where they do speak of trauma. There often it's a physical form of trauma, but they use the Greek word that would be similar to trauma. However, scientifically, you might say that we've kind of discovered the term and worked on it ever since the Vietnam War veterans came back from the Vietnam War. You might say that all modern trauma studies derive from this first, from the first day that these soldiers came back. And we didn't understand it, and there was a lot of work that was done to get to know what was happening to these vets that were coming back. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder from Vietnam War, increased our understanding of PTSD in sexual abuse survivors. The seminal work by Judith Herman that's referred to in your bibliography, she speaks of all of the symptomology that is characteristic of people that came back from the Vietnam War. And she was one of the first ones to make parallels between people who came back, veterans, and people who had experienced sexual abuse. That's when first you might say the category of PTSD was officially recognized and used by practitioners in the mental health professions and applying it to sexual abuse survivors. Now notice I'm not using the term sexual abuse victims, and I will tell you more about that later. You might also say that the way that the experience of traumatology and science of traumatology developed really helped us also to understand concentration camps and all of the atrocities and the tragedies of war and of the darkest hours of the genocides that happened during the European Second World War, mainly in Europe, but everywhere else, and also with genocides in the 80s and the 90s. So a lot of the ways that we've intervened as communities with people who experienced genocide is to apply the categories of PTSD that we already studied that came from when we studied the Vietnam War veterans. Some long-term reactions to trauma, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, right? So unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, rumination, reimaging or thinking about the event over and over again. That's what rumination means. Strained relationships, the desire to either numb or to not be able to identify strong feelings. It's almost like there's a wave of a bunch of feelings that cannot be put together. When that happens, often, chances are, a trauma is lurking its ugly little head. Dissociation. Dissociation means you dissociate from the moment, from your body, and that's a protective mechanism. The trauma sometimes is so strong that if we didn't dissociate, we would disjoint and lose it completely. So we need to remember that some of these long-term reactions, although in long-term studies, we know that they can be very nefarious and very negative, we know that the initial reaction of dissociation and of having difficulty during a trauma is a protective mechanism. So we survive it because we have the ability to dissociate. The problem is when the dissociation keeps happening. That's when it becomes a stress disorder. Hypervigilance, always being on the lookout for something wrong to happen, for the shoe to drop, for the looming cloud above your head. And also you might have strong physical reactions like headaches, nausea. So we're referring here to some psychosomatic effects of trauma. And as I said, some of these feelings are normal. It's when they're long-term that they become problematic. So what's the difference between a trauma and a complex trauma? A complex trauma is a stress or an event that you experience when it's caused by another person and that it occurs repeatedly, often escalating in severity. So people who have been survivors of torture, people who have been in trauma bonds with family members, those are examples of people who might develop more chronic traumatic symptomologies. Now, I'm not giving you all of this so that you can either self-diagnose or diagnose others. This is just so that we know what's behind the idea of resilience. You see, you can't really speak of resilience without knowing something about trauma. So the other thing that's important to know is that when we speak about a trauma, especially a complex one or complex traumas, they are premeditated and they involve a violation, an intrusion, or an exploitation of individuals. Slavery is a complex form of trauma. Sexual slavery, human trafficking, those are complex traumas. And they often do, not always, involve psychological and physical violence. Child abuse of any types that have occurred over a long period of time are often identified as possibly producing complex traumas. One thing I'm going to say here, and you need to write this down, although I told you you don't need to write anything down, is that it's not because you experienced a traumatic event that you will be traumatized. That's when resilience comes into play. Let me give you an example. When they had the Vietnam soldiers coming back from the war in Vietnam, they found that some veterans had no symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Strangely enough, other ones did, and some of them were in the same battalion. So obviously, there was something happening that made it so that some people would experience post-traumatic stress and other people didn't. That's what's interesting when we're doing studies on resilience. Why is it that people are traumatized and others aren't given certain events? And there is a form of what we call interpersonal trauma between individuals who are related or known to one another. For instance, the trauma of being insulted and or demeaned on a regular basis by a family member or a sibling over a long period of time with no change in it could develop in a form of complex trauma. Might be a mild form because there's mild, there's moderate, and there's severe trauma. But when we speak about complex trauma, we are speaking of something that takes much longer to address in either therapy, with spiritual care, pastoral care, whatever care needs to be applied. Okay, I'm going to go right down to the complex trauma, to the treatment stage, just so that you know what people do when they go through treatment, when they're experiencing trauma, and when they are engaging in a therapeutic relationship and or with group therapy or with people that we call self-help groups. Some self-help groups are very effective. 12-step groups, for instance, groups for bereaved widows, groups of people who are bereaved from suicide. Now, we need to remember that suicide is a specific kind of trauma because it's a violent death. And some people have found the person who had committed suicide. And so there's horrific connotations to the actual experience. So the treatment means 3 different stages: stabilization, processing the trauma, and reconnecting. Of course, you need to stabilize before they can process the trauma. You don't want them to start processing too quickly. So in stabilizing trauma, you educate the person about trauma, you help them emotionally regulate, and you develop a therapeutic alliance or bond with them. And also, if there are any issues of addiction, the first stage is where addiction should be addressed. Now, I don't know if you know this, but many recovery programs where you will go for 28 days or 3 months for drug addiction, you will be on the first or second week, you will be encouraged to meet somebody, and often they will have a trauma specialist on site, because often people self-medicate a trauma through the addiction of using substances and or alcohol in order to numb the experience of the trauma because it is so overwhelming. Then they learn to process the trauma, manage the pain, and also manage whatever relapse they experience. And then there's the reconnecting phase where they really look at developing and improving relationships, and they look at issues of intimacy and sexuality, which are key in people who have experienced especially physical and sexual trauma, because they often will have trust issues and or when they are being touched or when they are in a situation with another person one-on-one, they might be what we call re-triggered in their trauma. So often people, for instance, couples that go in counseling will find out that if there is an intimacy issues, it's not necessarily that there is a trauma, but it's possible that there is one somewhere in either of the partners in the marriage and in the people who are living together. Now, of course, there's a back and forth dynamic with these. It's like anything else. It's not a straight arrow that once you've done stabilization, no, it doesn't work that way. It really, you might be reconnecting and stabilizing within the same week or 2 or 3 when you are or months when you're processing whatever trauma you're working on. Now, I'd like to speak about vicarious trauma, and this is it's just an indication. I don't want to speak too long about it. This is what you pick up when you help other people that have been traumatized. And I think that compassion fatigue or vicarious or secondary trauma is probably what a lot of people who are in the helping profession are experiencing right now. People who are leaders in communities, pastors, doctors, nurses, counselors, they're seeing that a lot of people are coming to them for help, and they're being requested and required to listen and to be a witness to the pain, the fear, and the terror of people who've experienced different types of traumas. And probably during COVID-19, this has heightened to a certain degree. Now, some studies report that 40% to 85% of people who are in the helping profession will inevitably experience compassion fatigue. Basically, if you're a helper, you've had to deal with this in one way or another, unless you're an exceptionally well-balanced human being. And if you have any tips for me, I am willing to listen. Call me up and we can chat, because I don't know how to do it. And let's go down to the bottom of this slide, which is my main point about this. The helping professionals, you might even say a helping Christian, anyone who's willing to be there for others right now, more than ever, there are chances that they will be deeply affected by their work and or their ministry. And often the best and the brightest people in these fields of helping professions are the ones who are going to experience compassion fatigue and will have to learn to manage it. In fact, you might say that managing compassion fatigue is part and parcel of being a good, competent minister, healthcare provider. I want to illustrate, I think we have, I'm going to speak about resilience and finish with that. But right now I'm going to illustrate, I have to switch to a film. So post-traumatic growth is a term that was coined in 1995, and it had to do with the positive transformation that is possible when people undergo a kind of challenge and they meet it not necessarily head on in the sense of being willful and white knuckling it, but in the sense of this is we call it opportunity for growth. It's normally associated with a profound life-altering response to adversity of some kind. It could be any type of adversity. It could be having a disabled child. It could be experience violence in the home. It could be the neighborhood has been attacked and one of your neighbors was beaten and or shot. It's like normally the post-traumatic growth has to do with what has happened to you, but collectively can also happen when something is happening around you or people close to you. And this is when people have experienced all kinds of different difficult experiences, and they've responded to it by developing a certain kind of fortitude, forgiveness even, gratitude. You'll hear this in the 12-step program or other people. I'm glad I found out I was an alcoholic. It changed my life, and now I'm the better for it. Of course, while it happened, and while they were in the throes of their addiction, it was far from being something that they could express gratitude for. But this is, and that's why the term post is really important here. It's after the traumatic event has happened and a certain amount of healing has happened, and it's like a growth spurt that happens psychologically. Some people even experience it physically. There are people who have had physical adversities and they develop greater physical fortitude. So here, it doesn't have to do with just the ability, human ability to survive. It's also the human inclination to thrive when a traumatic experience has been successfully and or has been managed. Now, remember that when you have an experience like that, it's not really that the distress disappears. In fact, you've got to face it head on. So what are the 5 growth domains of post-traumatic growth? Greater appreciation for life, enhanced ability to manage interpersonal relationships, identification of new ways or reprioritizing in life. This will happen naturally for many of us at midlife. Richard Rohr and many others have talked about this, especially in a society where a lot of people are on the second half of life, now even on the other, at the end of the second half of life. We are aware that there's growth opportunities around us. And of course, as Christians, it's almost like, not that we look for them, but we might be more inclined to notice them because it's part and parcel of the idea of conversion, right? The turning around after you've experienced something and or where you need to change. But this is much more dramatic. Post-traumatic growth normally is rather dramatic. Now, unfortunately, American society and Western society in general is a little addicted to the idea that all trauma will equal growth. That's not true. There are people that do not grow from certain traumas. And it's hard to put numbers to it, but generally 2/3 to 75% of people will be able to move beyond trauma. But there's a 20 to 25% of people that take longer for the resilience to be instilled. And there's a smaller percentage of that unfortunately never are able to recover and have their lives significantly impaired by it. And finally, many people will say that they've experienced a kind of spiritual change or a development during this post-traumatic growth. So just one thing that these authors in 95 said, that they made a difference between resilience and traumatic events in that they believed that when you are resilient, you don't even experience the trauma. So this is the third paragraph. Authors here make a distinction between resilience as the ability to recover quickly from traumatic events, or even being able to resist being affected by them. Remember, I mentioned the soldiers who might have been exposed to the exact same experience, but some of them had and developed post-traumatic stress disorder, and other ones did not. Now, we need to remember that doesn't mean that other people are weaker or aren't able to mobilize things. It's just a mystery that some people seem to have this ability to resist and or to recover more quickly than others. And we know there are certain factors that precipitate or that help in that recovery. Now, here in contrast, the people say that when you have post-traumatic growth, you have been profoundly affected by the trauma. So basically, the authors seem to think that it's possible that you have had post-traumatic growth because you were not resilient. But as you will see, that's because they're limited to a certain view of what we are to understand as resilience. So what is resilience? And maybe this is time for group. I'll give this slide and then we'll do some group sharing. I want to make sure we have time for group sharing. So resilience can be described, and this is a very important, these two next slides are very significant. Resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress, such as family or relationship problems, serious health problems in the workplace, and or significant financial stressors. And resilience is a means of bouncing back, basically, from difficult experiences. Now, tomorrow, along with the PowerPoint presentation, you will also receive the pamphlet that was produced by the Association of the American Psychiatric Association. They, in 2005, came up with a pamphlet that was part of a huge campaign to develop resilience in Americans after the 9/11 incidents. This is when collectively the idea of resilience became much more predominant in American culture. It was present before, but it became much more prominent after the 9/11 attacks. Interestingly enough, nature and all non-human creation is resilient. Think about herd immunity, where a herd will develop immunity after a certain amount of members have increased their ability to resist a disease or any predator. That's a way that nature is resilient. And they said, when we were at the beginning of COVID, when all the cities around the world started slowing down because of lockdown, they said that the air started being a little pure. They weren't sure that that was going to last that long. But then they were talking about certain animals that were coming back in certain regions that had been deserted by them, certain waters that had seals in them again, because there was not as much traffic on the seas and the oceans. And so the resilience is not just a human experience, it's also experienced by all non-human creation. And resilience is a very complex thing. It's multidimensional. Genes are affected by that, physical ability, where we were born, how we were raised, and it's very dynamic in nature. It could move forward quickly, slow down. It's got its own rhythm and pace. It's important to identify it as a motivational force that all humans beings have. And that I repeat, resilience is a motivational force that all human beings are hardwired with. It's inherent to all of creation and human beings included. Now you'll notice here that both definitions agree that you need to experience a considerable amount of distress, and it could be that it's happening at the same time as you are growing. And this emotional distress is also something that, and the resistance or the resilience to it is not an extraordinary process. Unfortunately, the American tendency to look at rags to riches stories has the ability and more to publicize these fantastic, extraordinary people that we think, well, I'm not like that, but we all have it. Sometimes resilience has been portrayed a little too, it has been framed as an extraordinary experience, whereas it's an ordinary thing. You and I are probably resilient every day and we don't even realize it. Okay, that's as much as I wanted to say before